Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second of our webinars in our 4 series. Today's webinar is titled Conducting a Trauma-Informed Intake and Safety Planning Process. I wanted to remind you that this webinar series is brought to you by the kind people at the Office for Victims of Crime and OVCTTAC. So thank you to them for supporting this work and bringing this entire webinar series to all of you to join. We hope that you enjoyed the first webinar and live chat session, and we know that you will enjoy this second webinar just as much, if not more. It's full of wonderful information and really practical tips, so I hope you'll all get a lot out of it. And I'm going to turn it over now. I should have introduced myself. I'm sorry. I'm Jean Brueggemann. I'm the Executive Director of the Freedom Network USA. And we are, as we introduced ourselves initially in the first webinar, we're a nationwide network of service providers working with human trafficking survivors across the United States. And so we're here to bring you our experience and knowledge and share information with you and to help all of you participants to share information together. I now want to introduce Amy Fleischauer from the International Institute of Buffalo. She was our presenter on our first webinar and will be moderating and leading the remaining 3 webinars. Amy?
Thanks, Jean. Hi, everybody. So again, this is our second topic focus, and we are very excited that Elizabeth Medina from the San Francisco Child Abuse Prevention Center and Andrea Hughes from the Safe Horizons Trafficking Program will be leading us through this topic. Before they launch in, I just wanted, as a facilitator, to review and recap how this series is set up. It's a 4-part series, 4 different topics that really build on one another. So we ask that you join or watch the sessions in order. If you missed one session, to go back and listen to the prior one. That will allow you to gain the most information possible. The webinar today and the first webinar in each of the 4 topics are really going to be largely presentation style and focused on information. Again, the recordings will be available to all registrants during the series. And at the very end, the recordings will be available publicly. In 2 weeks, we will then change format and focus on an extensive Q&A. We wanted that to be more of a live chat, and so we would ask that during today's webinar, if you have a question that you would like answered in 2 weeks in that live chat, you can submit it via the question part of your toolbar, or you can email your question to an email address that will be available at the very end of today's webinar. So both of those are options. Again, submitting questions through the questions chat box, the questions box on your toolbar, or via email. And with that, I would like to immediately get into the crux of our presentation today. So I'll ask Elizabeth to continue.
Thank you, Amy, for that introduction. My name is Elizabeth Medina, and my role at the San Francisco Child Abuse Prevention Center is to coordinate the county's multidisciplinary team as it pertains to commercially sexually exploited children and youth. This is a new initiative that has been in place for a little over a year now, and so my role is facilitating that multidisciplinary team. Our organization also provides direct services to families as a support center, as well as is the Children's Advocacy Center in San Francisco and the setting for forensic multidisciplinary interviews. Great.
Hi, I'm Andrea Hughes. I'm the supervising social worker with the Safe Horizon Anti-Trafficking Program. Safe Horizon is a large victim service agency in New York where we serve all survivors of crime. The Anti-Trafficking Program has been around since 2001, and we provide client-centered, trauma-focused care both within in case management and also within the legal services that we have in our program. We have served a lot of clients over the years from 84 different countries, so we've had some really interesting experiences, certainly providing trauma-informed care, and I'm going to share some of those coming up. So I guess we can go ahead and get started. So what I would like to do is to kind of just briefly touch on and review from the first webinar the categories that are the foundation of trauma-informed care, because this is really going to provide the framework in how we're moving forward with the rest of our session. So really the key points here is that awareness of trauma is kind of integrated in all services, in the safety planning, in providing clients and understanding the importance of choice and control, and how important that is for clients, really focusing on strengths within the work. I think sometimes it can be easy for us to, lose that really kind of focus on client strengths given so many of the challenges that they have, so we'll be talking about that more. Also establishing a kind of a collaboration with clients, and not just with clients, but then also with colleagues and then other programs, and what that looks like coming from a trauma perspective and using that as a lens to provide those services. And then lastly, also maintaining cultural competency and understanding that trauma affects people in different ways and what that might look like, and how to incorporate a trauma-informed lens and being culturally competent at the same time. We are going to be focusing specifically in this webinar on the intake process and also safety planning. So we can go to the next slide. So these are kind of the things that we wanted to cover today. So our objectives today was that participants will learn strategies for engaging clients who have experienced trauma in service provision. Participants will understand how to implement an intake process that is trauma-informed, and participants will also at the end understand how to conduct a trauma-informed safety plan. And again, so what we're the way that we're approaching this is that, how do we first kind of meet and engage clients in this process, as intake can be, maybe quite arduous, and really it may be that first kind of interaction that a client may have with the program, and really trying to maintain that trauma-informed lens throughout. So if we could, in the spirit of talking about trauma, if we could just take a moment and take a breath and look at this beautiful picture that's in our PowerPoint here, and just kind of glance at the colors and the deep pinks and the deep blues and green. And I just wanted to share this because this is kind of one of my favorite grounding techniques. It's I like to have postcards from museums or really nice pictures, beautiful pictures of nature, because staring at it and looking at the colors and the shapes and the image, it helps bring me back to the present moment, but then it also helps me to kind of reconnect and to the beauty in the world that sometimes I think in this work, kind of gets lost sometimes. Okay. All right, so how trauma might impact the process of really doing intake and safety planning. So a couple of things I wanted to point out is that for so many clients who are survivors of trafficking, that is an interpersonal trauma, meaning it was perpetrated by another person, may or may not have had a relationship with, it may or may not have been somebody that they trusted at one point, and then in my experience anyway, I've found that many of our clients who have experienced trafficking have also experienced maybe childhood abuse or prior domestic violence. And so this interpersonal trauma piece is really important to kind of recognize and understand in your programs because it makes it really difficult for clients to trust others and make a connection. Elizabeth's going to talk about engagement in a moment, but I just wanted us to really think about, how clients who have gone through so many of the challenges that they've went to, how really it's like such an important and amazing step that they take to even, reach out to our programs or come to our programs but for help. Also keeping in mind that clients may be triggered by receiving help and receiving assistance. I've had clients in the past that it really takes some time to build trust with them and connection because they've always had to pay in some way for receiving help, or they become triggered by people being too nice because in the end that means that something bad is going to happen. Another way that trauma may impact the process is that they are going to often display a very wide range of emotions, or none at all. And I think it's important for as staff to remember that even if they're not displaying any emotions at all, as they're talking about their experience, that doesn't mean that they weren't traumatized by it, and it's not. It's still a framework that is very useful and important to continue to have in place, even if they don't display what may be typical signs of trauma. In fact, not showing any emotion is a symptom of trauma as well. Another thing to keep in mind in this process is that it may be difficult for clients to take in new information. If they're nervous about being in the office or meeting with you or talking about what they've experienced, and meeting new people, and maybe they have just left their trafficking situation, it may be very difficult for them to take in new information. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but I just wanted to put that out there, that is a way that the trauma can affect clients. And then I also really wanted to point out too, lastly, that it's important, I think we need to recognize how trauma may affect staff in the intake process as well. And so staff are in a position where they may have to ask a number of questions to really assess what happened to the client and whether or not they're a good fit for our program. And if they've experienced or experiencing vicarious trauma, that may impact how they're asking the questions. They may not get all of the information that they need because they may not want to go to some of the more difficult places. And then too, they may only focus on services and not on really tapping into that emotional need that needs to be addressed at the same time in order for clients to be able to effectively engage in services. And with that, speaking of engagement, we'll move on to Elizabeth.
And in those first meetings, what are some things that we really need to be conscious of, cognizant of? As Andrea just said, a lot of times we think of our first meeting in terms of the information that we need to gather. And how do we reframe that for the goal of the interaction to be simply building trust and connection? And for me, when I was working directly with clients and running an anti-trafficking program, one of my mantras was that building trust and connection is ultimately more important than whether the survivor enrolls in the program or not. And I think that's oftentimes a hard philosophy to live out, but also to really keeping that in mind as a goal, that the goal is to build trust and connection. And then considering, how a client comes to your doors, whether it's through a law enforcement operation, or they're referred by another agency, or they're referred by someone that's close to them, how does that referral then impact your ability to engage and build that trust and connection? What are some of the preconceived notions that the client may already be walking into that room with based on how they came to you? And so it's really important in that first meeting to be careful and clear as to how and why we're engaging, and to recognize that trauma may affect some of those information gathering goals of being able to recall aspects of the experience, dates, times, and ability to concentrate. And so being really mindful of that and really stepping back in terms of our expectations and what we're seeking to accomplish in that first meeting. So with that, we're moving into a poll. What is your program's most common referral source?
So this is Amy. We'll just let people answer for about another 20 seconds, and when the poll is closed, you'll be able to see the results. Just a few more seconds. Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to talk about, or Andrea, the results here? Are you able to see them? Elizabeth, are you able to see the results?
It's partially covered on my screen. 35% law enforcement, 28% word of mouth, 2% healthcare provider, 5% child welfare, and 30% social service agency or other. So with that, recognizing that our clients may come to us with a lot of preconceived notions based on how they come to us, what are practical techniques then that we can use to really engage the client and help them feel more at ease and start to build that trust and connection? The image that you have in front of you is really simple. It's just breathe. And I use that, and I use breathing and relaxation techniques that when I notice the client's body language is telling me that they're uncomfortable or that I'm upset, I don't just continue with the intake or continue with the goal of the meeting, but really just thinking through how do I help this client right now to feel more comfortable, more at ease, and really just help them come back to a normal or a more calm state, I should say. So some more practical engagement tips. Again, checking our expectations about the first meeting. One of the expectations that I really had to check myself on is not trying to draw out the entire story in the first meeting. I think we know intrinsically that it's going to take time to hear a client's story if the client gets to the point where they're even comfortable sharing their story. But you know, when a lot of times in our day-to-day work, how we schedule clients or what we need to accomplish in that meeting, sometimes it conflicts with what we know is true about being trauma-informed. And so really having that ability to slow down and really check our expectations and check our assumptions. Oftentimes, there's a label of a client being resistant, and oftentimes if we can slow down and really see, is the client being resistant to the process, or are they frustrated because they're having to recall memories that are difficult, and essentially they're reliving their story, and are they frustrated or irritated with having to do that? there may be some very core things that are beneath what may appear to be client resistance. And recognizing and validating a client's distrust of systems, especially if they've had negative experiences before with some of those systems that are often the ones that refer clients to us, like law enforcement or child welfare or healthcare providers. And it's really important to empower clients to ask those questions and to be honest about their hesitations rather than jumping to the defense of these systems that we may have partners in or we may work really closely with. And so one of the things that I've really had to do is empower the client to ask those questions and to address those hesitations that they may have. And more specifically, working with youth, it's being that consistent person. It's understanding that oftentimes youth that have been involved in either foster care or juvenile justice, they usually walk into a room and people already know all about them from their case file. And so what does it mean to really get to know that youth for who they are, their likes, their dislikes, their friends, their school, what their hobbies are, really getting to know them as people instead of what's just in their case file. Is really, really important, and really showing an interest in who they are as people goes a long way in terms of engaging them. And especially when youth are mandated into services because of being in juvenile probation or other circumstances, really emphasizing and reinforcing their choice and being able to meet, you know, at the park or at the mall, or I've taken clients grocery shopping and, you know, we talk while we're picking out whatever grocery items they need. And also what happens during that meeting. You know, a lot of times youth that are in these systems are inundated with therapists, and recognizing the value of therapy, and also that our engagement doesn't necessarily need to always be a talking conversation, but can be drawing pictures, going for a walk, other strategies that may be different from what the youth is accustomed to because of other mandated treatments. And so another population that I really wanted to focus on was foreign nationals, and recognizing that oftentimes they come from countries where law enforcement is not trusted and judicial systems may be corrupt, and being really clear about the role of law enforcement and what law enforcement may or not be able to do in that particular client's case. Really want to refer to some of the handouts that are in the sidebar as far as the who's who handout, and giving them concrete examples that basically, if they give a statement to an officer, that may not necessarily guarantee that an investigation will be opened or that it's going to go to prosecution. You know, being very transparent about the parameters, the limitations, and the realities of the criminal justice system as it is in the United States, and being specific and recognizing those things is going to help to mitigate that distrust that a client may come in to that meeting with. So the next picture is of a really messy, frantic office, and what this represents is one of my personal experiences, a story of what not to do. I was working, and it was a July 4th weekend, 100-degree plus weather, late afternoon. We were in the middle of moving offices at the organization where I previously worked, and it was really chaotic, and there was no meeting space. And we get a call late in the afternoon that a federal law enforcement agency had recovered 4 victims from an agricultural trafficking situation, a labor trafficking situation. And I look back and I think about this experience, and you know, we had people sitting literally like in the middle of boxes, and it was very, very chaotic. And if I was to go back and reflect, I could have really slowed down and try to see it from the client's perspective. You know, when they're sitting literally in the middle of chaos, are we just bringing more chaos into their life? You know, are we instilling trust in them and that they can trust us with their care? And in hindsight, I could have used a partner's agency space or postponed that intake rather than just rushing forward because, you know, everything was kind of in crisis. And Andrea is going to talk more about creating a safe space.
Thank you. So there are a number of different factors to think about and consider when creating a safe space for your clients. And the first one I kind of want to point out is the positioning of chairs. And I know it seems kind of simple, and we all have probably limited space that we're working within. But I know, like, my experience has just been that clients have you know, it's hard for them to sit with their back to the door. We've had a small, in our program, like a small counseling room where one chair is definitely going to be, you know, with the back to the door, and so the client really has a weird choice of either having their back to the door or then feeling kind of trapped in if I'm sitting with my back to the door and they're sitting in the other chair. And so like, I've had to have conversations with clients to really kind of help them identify like what chair would be most comfortable for them and what comes up for them and how can we kind of work through that a little bit so that they feel better, given that sometimes, you know, this is the limitations of our offices. Another challenge that has come up for us personally as well is that you know, sometimes our walls are relatively thin, or there may be some office noises that are really loud. For example, our AC, when it goes on in the summertime, makes a really loud bang, and it jumps me at times as well. And so it's just another opportunity to really kind of talk to the client about that and check with them and let them know beforehand, like, that this is what's going to happen. It's the AC. You know, and see what we could do to kind of alleviate whatever feelings might come up. Body language as well is important to think about. Again, another example of some things that I've had to work through is that I tend to talk a lot with my hands, and that's been a process that I've really have had to rein in a lot over the years, because any kind of sudden movement, especially with hands, can be very kind of triggering for clients who may have been physically assaulted or abused in any way, and so that takes some practice to try and kind of rein that in a little bit, and to really watch like whether or not you find yourself leaning forward to a client, which may seem a little threatening, or whether you're turning away from them because maybe the story is a little bit too much to take, so you find yourself turning away. All of these things can really make a person feel unsafe, and so it's important to try to sit in a calm, open manner and try to remain that way through session. I think the one last thing I would want to touch on here too is, again, to kind of go back to staff and the fact that they kind of need to feel safe too. And so for staff, providing staff with opportunities to learn how to and tools to practice remaining present and grounded during sessions, I think is really important. So if a client is sharing something with a staff member and that they become triggered in session, the staff member does, you know, what are tools and techniques that they could have to kind of remain as grounded as possible and present in the session. And I think one thing that can be helpful for both staff and clients in creating a safe space is the idea of routine. So for staff, you know, what are they doing before a session? So maybe like just taking a moment to, you know, meditate or do deep breathing or journal, whatever is helpful for them before meeting with the client. And then during session to really set up some sort of routine where maybe the staff member and the client, you know, does a grounding technique together at the beginning and then go through session, and then at the end does another grounding technique, which is beneficial for everyone. And then after, you know, after the client leaves, then having a staff member maybe do something to, you know, kind of close the session for themselves, and that may be like physically brushing some of the pain or energy that they may have soaked in during session off of them, or going to take a brief walk or talking to a colleague or something. But so an important part of creating safe space is client choice and control, and making sure during the intake process that they do really have the opportunity to make the decisions, and have some control in the process where you're working together, where the staff members really just providing a lot of information and allowing the client to make the decision that is best for them. So I think one way to kind of start out is to ask the clients if it's okay to ask questions, and kind of let them know that, a part of the intake process is going to be, there's a certain amount of information that needs to be gathered. And, we can come up with a process together to make that easy as possible, maybe introducing some grounding techniques if that is something that they think might be helpful for them, or taking it slow to where you may, depending on what your program's mandates are, you may need, could maybe spread it out over a session or two. But I think it's really important to explain the intake process, so that they fully understand what that's all about and what you will be doing. I think there have been times I feel like in the rush we haven't been always really good at explaining what that's all about, and for us and probably many programs, our clients do have to meet the legal standards of trafficking, and so it's, I think, like beyond asking the questions, there's a reason behind that. It's important for clients to understand that. So we have a couple of handouts that are on your sidebar that you can explore, but one explains in a lot of detail the agency services, and it's the rights and responsibilities and expectations. And so when you get a moment to please go ahead and review that. The reason, again, that we have that document for our program is that it provides a nice list of the services that we can provide, and then really like the responsibilities that a client has, the responsibilities that we have, and the rights that the clients have in the program. And again, like, it's a lot of information, which is why we have it written down and something to hand out and go over with the client, and they can take it home with them if they want, and review that later once they feel like have a moment to kind of breathe. Then we also have another handout that's kind of on the roles of like the different players who may be, involved in a client's case. It's the one that I've shared is, just an example. I would probably include a lot fewer people in general, like especially at the beginning, because not all clients will interact with everyone that's shown on that side, on that handout. But it's just an idea of like a really kind of basic draft of that might be helpful. Okay, I think another important thing to keep in mind that's also very, trauma-focused, trauma-informed is to focus on client strengths. I think sometimes when our work, it's easy to forget that, they've already survived a lot. They've already lived an entire life. They have a lot of strengths and a lot of internal resources, if not some external as well. And so what I like to do in sessions is to really bring the client's attention to their strengths as they come up. I might help them identify them just so they can see what strengths there are available to them, so they can more purposefully, tap into them when they want to or they need to. And also, given that many clients, their self-esteem is really not in a great place, so I think it's helpful for them to really start to identify some of those, all the positive qualities that they have. Another piece about this that's important in focusing on client strengths is it helps us, it helps staff, it helps us with vicarious trauma because I think it switches this responsibility a little bit. I think we all tend to take on a great sense of responsibility that really isn't ours to take on. And it may come from a place of feeling helpless or powerless and not recognizing all of the really amazing qualities that clients are coming to us with. I think that it's also can kind of, if we're not paying attention to client strengths, it might move us more into a place of pity and not empathy and not seeing them as a whole person. And then just one last point about this is that I also like to share with clients, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, but so many, I think like every client I've ever met with has said that they're quote unquote crazy, and I think it can be really helpful to help them understand, that their trauma symptoms are survival adaptations, and that they adapted to survive, and that's really, really, their mind and their body doing everything it could and being really super amazing that they that it did what it did to help them through their trauma. So then on collaboration, so for collaboration in terms of really maintaining a trauma perspective, it's to think of it in terms of both with collaborating with clients, so that all the work that you would do with a client, you're doing it together, and so to approach it as a team, because they really are experts in their lives and in their experience, and what they need and what they don't need. And so it kind of goes back to like, let us work together to come up with solutions and ideas and brainstorm, and then just come up with those options and information, and then the client makes that choice in the end. And it may be a choice that we might struggle with personally, but it's really up to the client. So for example, sometimes it happens in New York where clients decide to make the decision to sleep in the park instead of going to public shelter. And that's their decision, and we may struggle with that, but that's up to them. After given the information, that's very much a valid choice. And then I think with collaborating with colleagues and partners and thinking about trauma is to find a way to kind of streamline the process a little bit, so that the clients don't have to keep retelling their stories over and over again. And then the other part of that too is that if a client, there will be cases where clients do have to tell their story again, so then working with the client together to identify what tools or techniques might be helpful for them to be able to tell their story in a manner that keeps them feeling emotionally safe. And in terms of, I just have a quick example, in our program, our intake process, we've recently had to streamline because we kind of took a step back and realized that somebody's making a call to do the initial kind of really brief assessment as to whether or not there might be trafficking, and then somebody else may do the intake, the official intake, and then somebody else may be assigned as a case manager. And that's just, just really confusing, and, information is going to have to be re-asked to the client. So we're really trying to get it down to whoever's making the phone call will then do intake and then see the client as much as possible, or at least, if one person does the initial call, then whoever does intake would then take the client. And then we'll hand over to Elizabeth for cultural considerations.
Definitely. Culture plays a really big role in terms of how clients perceive services and how clients perceive even help-seeking behaviors. An example of this, I had several clients from a particular cultural group that were not accepting rental assistance. They were willing to accept gift cards or clothing vouchers, but not receiving the rental assistance. So in my mind's eye as a manager, I'm thinking, wow, they're leaving a lot of resources on the table, like what's going on? And after talking to several clients from this particular cultural group, I noticed that they thought that it was a loan. They thought that it was a debt that they had to pay back, and especially thinking through, okay, if a person's coming from a labor trafficking situation or they've continuously had to pay back a debt to their trafficker, how do we frame the services in a way where they can understand that any financial assistance given is not a loan? And so eventually we incorporated that into the intake process and said, you know, you don't have to pay us back for gift cards, you don't have to pay us back for rental assistance. This is resources that we receive in order to help you after this situation and help you meet your basic needs. And so really being clear about how any type of assistance works when there are those cultural factors of forced fraud and coercion. And just reinforcing that client choice with what service providers if they can have someone from their own ethnic community or not, if that service is available, and really being aware too of our own cultural lens and assumptions and how that can impact the relationship with the client. So with that, we're going to move into language access, and we have another polling question.
Okay, just a couple, this is Amy, just about 10 more seconds if you could please vote or participate in the poll is a better way of saying it.
Great. So does your program have a language access plan? 68% said that they do have a language access plan. 17% said no, our program does not have a language access plan. And 15% said, what is a language access plan? So I'm glad to see the majority of people do. So why is language access important? Creating that plan in advance and avoiding using people who may not necessarily have, they may know the language but not necessarily have capacity, and recognizing the difference that linguistic capacity does not necessarily mean cultural competency or the ability or skill set around being victim-centered. A quick example of that is in working with clients that were referred to us after a law enforcement operation on massage parlors, and the clients being very clear that they did not want to speak with the male interpreter, and so being as sensitive to that as possible, and really checking if the gender is what the client is comfortable with, checking with the interpreter of what biases they may have, or if they having a pre and post with the interpreter, and then also language access in terms of written materials. Clients should have as much as possible documents in their own language, or if they don't have literacy, also considering that, and even translating concepts. Like when we talk about strengths, is that something that a client can connect to, or what language can we use to better frame that so that clients can really get what we're trying to accomplish. So moving on.
Excuse me. Can you just explain, we have a question here, just to review what a language access plan is, since a percentage chose in the poll that they didn't know what it was.
Sure. So a language access plan is something that can be program specific or organization wide. Of if you have a language that is not your primary language, how do you access the resources within your own organization if you have multilingual staff, or if you have a plan in place to contract out with either a language line or interpreter service, and having those things already in place before engaging a client who doesn't share a primary language.
That's great. Thank you so much. This is Amy. I just, in short, also the way that we think about it here at the International Institute of Buffalo is in a way of how can we ensure that anyone who walks through our doors or anyone who calls on the phone can be served in the same way as someone who would call and speak English or speak a language that one of our case managers speaks. So it's just a kind of a broader way to think about it.
Thank you. So moving into safety planning, realizing that some of the coping skills that have worked for the survivor, how are those coping skills? How do we maximize those coping skills? Where are times where those coping skills need to be adapted or replaced as life skills and circumstances change? Recognizing that safety is both physical and psychological. To give you an example, I had a client who I worked with over the course of 9 months, and over the course of 9 months, she changed housing or shelter about 20 times. And each time she changed, it was for a different reason, because of something that happened with staff, or she didn't feel safe, she saw another client smoking or smelled cigarette smoke, or different things that triggered her so that she then no longer felt safe in that placement. And so one of the conversations I had with her was what helps her to feel safe, and realizing that what are things that we can do to modify the environment so that you do feel safe rather than changing the environment completely. Because she also had children with her, and changing schools 20 times was also not benefiting her children. So it's one of those things of, do we need to replace those skills entirely, or can we adapt those skill sets? Can we adapt the environment so that the client does feel safe? And there's also more practical engagement tips that are in the sample safety plan document that's with the handouts. And so going into more practical tips and mindsets, realizing too that safety planning does not begin or end with the case manager. Oftentimes we had to adapt our plan to say, what are things that the client is going to do in order to keep themselves safe? Because like Andrea was saying, we may have that sense of responsibility, but at the end of the day, it's the client who really works and has this plan to really keep themselves safe, including having the right phone numbers and having those skills in place so that whether they leave services or go back to the situation or enter into something new, that they have those skills, those help-seeking behaviors in order to really assess and coordinate their safety. So it's building those skills over a period of time. And also with social media, not being the social media police, but empowering clients to really make decisions about their phones, about social media, especially in agencies that have a no phone policy, thinking how that can be re-traumatizing to someone who's been trafficked as well. And going to the next slide as well, thinking through what are some of the menu of services that we have and whether those services are appropriate. If programs are housed within a domestic violence, sexual assault organization, at times it's seen as everyone that goes through our services gets restraining orders or protective orders, but really thinking through what is most appropriate for the client. And so, for example, how those processes may be re-traumatizing. So if we go to the next slide, thinking through, does the client have to face their perpetrator in court? How is that going to impact their mental health? How is that going to impact their well-being? And assessing whether the protective order is appropriate, if there's a benefit to the client's case. I had the benefit of having an attorney in-house that worked with all of our trafficking clients. And so if you do have those legal resources, really thinking through how to partner with the legal resources that you have in order to assess what may be appropriate for the client. And accessing assistance through victims' comp or address confidentiality programs. These are really tools that have been in place for a very long time in different states, and so it's thinking of how to adapt those tools to this population and how our clients can really benefit from these programs. And with that, we're moving into our third polling question.
Yes, how does your program address staff safety?
Now we're nearing the end, but only 50% of you have voted. So please participate. I'll just give you another 10 seconds.
Okay, so 35% of the programs have a formalized safety plan. 40% talk a lot about safety but don't have a formal plan. 12% discuss safety when there's an incident, and 14 really discuss staff safety. Okay, so that's, I think that probably the second part where there's a lot of talk about safety but there may not be a formal plan, you know, I think that may be the case for many organizations, and we're going to talk a little bit about safety planning with staff right now. Okay, so, you know, again, to go back to this trauma-informed lens, this framework is, you know, again, safety is a really important issue, not just for clients, but also for staff. It's important to try to get all staff, all program staff, involved in safety planning, even if they don't face clients. You know, it's important for them to know and be a part of the plan, because they may be the ones that we turn to for help if we're having a problem. I think another component of staff safety planning that's really interesting and important is the fact that we really model safety and the importance of safety to our clients. Clients who have experienced trauma often have a really hard time identifying and recognizing you know, danger, and that's physiological and emotional, and it's a result of trauma. But I think part of, you know, us really holding that at very high importance for ourselves and for staff helps them to start to learn and recognize how important it is, and it's just another lens in which that they could start thinking. And so I think, you know, one example that we have in our program is that, you know, we're really careful about cell phones, and we are, you know, lucky enough that we do have funding that can help buy, you know, new cell phones for clients, but it's one of the first conversations that we have as to whether or not the clients got their phone from their trafficker or if they've had their phone while they were being trafficked, and then we do ask for them to give that up, you know, as a precaution, and then we would give them another one. And that's a really hard conversation to have sometimes. Clients don't always want to do that, but then when we talk about safety and the options and the possibility of, you know, maintaining safe by not using that phone that somebody else may have had access to, they start to understand that we're taking their safety and our safety really important. The other thing too is that we really make sure that they don't, we have a conversation about with them about not talking to others or telling others that they are working with us. I think and where we're located or anything like that. And I think part of it is just, you know, with the nature of trafficking, our clients don't always know who's involved. And we've recently had an incident that where you know, a trafficker found out that I was helping a client plan to escape, you know, and it was through somebody who had actually came to our program who was also a victim of the same trafficker. And so there was a real, you know, sense of urgency around that, and had to have some conversations with the client about what that means for our safety and their safety. And I think to kind of, you know, continue with safety planning for staff, and when you're developing those plans to really, or even just having the conversations, if you haven't gotten to a plan yet, that's fine, but when you're having those conversations, to really keep in mind the role of vicarious trauma. So in that example of, you know, that incident where a trafficker found out I was helping a client, we went crazy. Honestly, like our program, we started making just grand plans of, you know, having, you know, a large metal bar across our doors, having cameras in like all of our rooms, including the rooms we have with our clients, really like, you know, just really kind of getting pretty elaborate. And we had to stop and take a step back and say, like, you know what, actually, if we have clients coming in and we're trying to create a safe space and we're trying to create a healing space, what does it look like? What would it look like to have all of these locks and all of these cameras? And we realized it was really, our vicarious trauma was flaring up around this. And the reality of the situation didn't really match our response in that case. So we had to take a step back and realize, like, okay, like let's really kind of be as realistic as possible in this, and, you know, and make whatever plans we need to, but not in a way that's, you know, going to make us feel weird coming to work, or our clients to come here either. And then lastly, for next steps is to think about, you know, to examine your agency safety plan or your program safety plan. If you're part of a larger agency, they may have other programs may have plans that maybe you could borrow and integrate into your program. We've had to do that a few times. Like, we look to our, you know, our domestic violence programs or our hotline programs, or our court programs too, are a really great resource to find out what they do in some of these situations. And you know, and so if you don't have a safety plan yet, to maybe, you know, just start to get a few things in place, at least, you know, if you were in jeopardy, you know, is who would be able to like call 911 if that was, you know, the need for that. And then lastly, when thinking about our next couple of webinars coming up, we're going to be talking about moving into more case management and referrals. And so before those webinars, to kind of think about how your agency works with other service providers, using, you know, that trauma lens and that trauma framework, and then how you can reduce trauma for clients when engaging other agencies. And again, trying to keep within that the trauma framework. And so with that, we'll move to the next slide. And
this is our second webinar that we've finished almost exactly on time. So this is like Andrea, and thank you so much for the information that you shared today. I want to thank the participants who have already submitted questions throughout today's webinar in the question or chat box, and we will absolutely address that in 2 weeks. If you are thinking of other questions that come up, please do send them to this email address, tictraining@freedomnetworkusa.org, and that email address will also be available in a follow-up email that you will soon receive that also has this link. Don't feel like you need to copy this down. This evaluation link will also be in a follow-up email that you will receive shortly. So we are excited to live chat with all of you on August 30th at the same time, which is 3 o'clock Eastern Time. And again, thank you to all for your participation today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.